Sarah Martinez had spent
Prepare for the
12 years
briefing.
climbing the
We move
military
at
ranks,
dawn.
earning every stripe and star through blood, sweat, and countless sleepless nights. At 34, she commanded respect from thousands of soldiers across 3 military bases. But today, dressed in civilian clothes and driving an unmarked sedan toward Fort Thunder's main gate, she looked like just another visitor trying to enter the most secure military installation in the region. What happened next would become the most talked-about incident in Fort Thunder's 70-year history. 3 rookie recruits, barely 2 weeks into their service, were about to make the biggest mistake of their military careers. They had no idea that the woman they were about to challenge to a fight was the same person whose photograph hung in the base commander's office, whose signature appeared on their deployment orders, and whose reputation for battlefield excellence had earned her the nickname Iron Eagle throughout the armed forces. This is the true story of how a case of mistaken identity, a moment of foolish bravado, and 3 overconfident young soldiers created a confrontation that would change everything at Fort Thunder forever. The morning sun cast long shadows across the entrance of Fort Thunder as General Sarah Martinez approached the main gate in her personal vehicle. After spending the weekend at her sister's wedding in the nearby town of Millfield, she was returning to base earlier than expected. Her usual military uniform was replaced by a simple blue dress and light cardigan, a stark contrast to the commanding presence she typically projected in her official capacity. Sarah had specifically chosen to drive her personal car instead of her official military vehicle to maintain a low profile during her sister's wedding. The black sedan bore no military markings or special plates that would immediately identify her rank or position. She preferred to keep her personal life separate from her military responsibilities whenever possible, a practice that had served her well throughout her distinguished career. As she approached the security checkpoint, Sarah noticed 3 young recruits manning the gate alongside the regular security personnel. Their uniforms were crisp and new, their posture rigid with the kind of nervous energy that marked fresh soldiers still adjusting to military life. She recognized the look immediately, having seen thousands of new recruits pass through her command over the years. Private Jackson, a tall young man from rural Tennessee, was the first to spot the approaching civilian vehicle. At 19 years old, he had joined the military straight out of high school, driven by family tradition and a desire to prove himself. His father and grandfather had both served with distinction, and Jackson felt the weight of their legacy on his shoulders every day since arriving at Fort Thunder. Standing beside him was Private Chun, a former college athlete who had left his scholarship behind to pursue military service after feeling unfulfilled by civilian life. At 21, he was slightly older than most recruits, but carried himself with the confidence that came from his background in competitive sports. His athletic build and quick reflexes had already earned him recognition during basic training. The third member of the trio was Private Rodriguez, whose family had immigrated from Mexico when she was young. At 18, she was the youngest of the group, but possessed a fierce determination that had impressed her drill sergeants. She had joined the military to gain citizenship and create opportunities for her younger siblings, carrying the hopes of her entire family with her. The regular gate security officer, Sergeant Williams, was temporarily away from his post handling paperwork inside the guard station. This left the 3 recruits with more autonomy than they typically had, a situation that would prove problematic in the coming moments. As Sarah's car approached the checkpoint, Private Jackson stepped forward with his hand raised to signal her to stop. The protocol for civilian vehicles entering the base was straightforward but thorough, requiring proper identification, background verification, and a legitimate reason for entry. "Good morning, ma'am," Jackson said as Sarah rolled down her window. "I'll need to see your identification and the purpose of your visit to Fort Thunder today." Sarah reached into her purse and handed over her military identification card. However, the card was in a protective sleeve, and the lighting at the gate made it difficult to read clearly. Jackson examined the card briefly but failed to notice the rank insignia or the special markings that would have immediately identified Sarah as a high-ranking officer. "I'm returning from leave," Sarah explained simply, not wanting to make a big production of her rank or position. She had always believed in treating all personnel with respect, regardless of their position in the military hierarchy. Private Chin moved closer to the vehicle, Noticing Sarah's civilian attire and the absence of any obvious military bearing in her relaxed posture. Her hair was down in soft waves rather than in the tight bun required by military regulations, and her makeup was more elaborate than what would be permitted in uniform. "Ma'am, are you sure you're military personnel?" Chen asked with a skeptical tone. "You don't really look like you belong on a military base." Sarah raised an eyebrow at the comment, but maintained her composure. She had encountered skepticism before, particularly early in her career when female officers were less common. However, she was surprised to face such direct questioning from recruits who should have been more focused on following proper procedures. "I can assure you that I belong here," Sarah replied calmly. "Perhaps you could call your supervisor to verify my credentials if there's any confusion." Private Rodriguez joined the conversation, emboldened by her colleague's apparent confidence. "Listen, lady, we get a lot of people trying to get onto this base who don't belong here. Just because you have some kind of ID doesn't mean you're really one of us." The situation was escalating in a direction that none of the recruits fully understood. They were operating under several false assumptions about the woman in the car, and their inexperience was leading them to make increasingly poor decisions. Jackson felt compelled to assert his authority, misreading Sarah's calm demeanor as a sign of weakness or deception. "You know what, ma'am? I think you need to step out of the vehicle so we can properly verify who you are." Sarah considered her options carefully. She could easily resolve the situation by demanding to speak with their commanding officer or by making a simple phone call that would immediately clarify her identity. However, she was curious to see how far the recruits would take their misguided challenge. "I understand you're doing your job," Sarah said, opening her car door and stepping out. "But I think there might be some confusion here that we can clear up quickly." As Sarah stood beside her vehicle, the three recruits formed a loose semicircle around her. Her civilian clothes and relaxed appearance continued to reinforce their mistaken belief that she was not a legitimate military person. Chun crossed his arms and adopted a more aggressive stance. "Look, we've been trained to spot people who don't belong here. You might have fooled other guards, but we're not that easy to trick." "That's right," Rodriguez added. "We know what real soldiers look like, and you're not it." Sarah realized that the recruits had moved far beyond standard security procedures and were now operating on pure assumption and bravado. Their behavior was concerning not only because of their treatment of her personally, but because it represented a serious breach of military protocol and respect. Jackson stepped closer to Sarah, his confidence growing with each passing moment. "You know what? I bet you're just some civilian who thinks she can sweet-talk her way onto a military base. Well, that's not happening on our watch." The irony of the situation was not lost on Sarah. These three recruits, who had been in the military for less than a month, were challenging the very person responsible for their training, discipline, and career development. Their complete failure to recognize her authority represented exactly the kind of arrogance and poor judgment that she had spent her career working to eliminate from military culture. "I think you should reconsider your approach here," Sarah said, her voice carrying a subtle warning that the recruits failed to detect. "This situation doesn't have to escalate any further." Chun laughed and looked at his companions. "Did you hear that? She's trying to threaten us. I think this fake soldier needs to learn some respect for real military personnel." Rodriguez nodded in agreement. "Maybe we should teach her what happens when civilians try to impersonate soldiers." Jackson, feeling emboldened by his colleague's support, made the decision that would define the rest of this encounter. "You know what, lady? I challenge you to prove you're really military material. How about we settle this with a little physical demonstration?" Sarah looked at each of the three recruits in turn, seeing in their faces the kind of overconfidence and poor judgment that could be dangerous both in training and in combat situations. She knew that this moment presented an opportunity for a valuable lesson, though not the kind the recruits were expecting. "Are you sure about that?" Sarah asked quietly. "Because once we start down this path, there's no going back." The three recruits exchanged glances, interpreting her question as a sign that she was backing down. They had no way of knowing that they were about to confront someone whose combat training and physical conditioning far exceeded anything they had encountered in their brief military experience. Chun cracked his knuckles dramatically. "We're sure. Time for you to learn what real soldiers are capable of." Sarah nodded slowly, her expression shifting subtly as she mentally prepared for what was about to happen. The calm, patient woman who had been trying to peacefully resolve the situation was about to reveal capabilities that would shock and humble the three overconfident recruits. "Very well," Sarah said, removing her cardigan and folding it carefully. "But I want you to remember that you insisted on this approach." As the confrontation moved toward its inevitable conclusion, none of the recruits had any idea that they were about to face someone whose military training, combat experience, and physical conditioning represented the absolute pinnacle of what they hoped to achieve in their own careers. The lesson they were about to learn would be far more profound and humbling than anything they could have imagined when they first spotted her civilian vehicle approaching the gate. The stage was set for a confrontation that would become legendary throughout Fort Thunder, though not for the reasons the three recruits expected. In their eagerness to prove themselves as capable soldiers, they had unknowingly challenged the one person on the entire base who was least likely to be intimidated by their bravado, and most capable of teaching them the lesson they desperately needed to learn about humility, respect, and the true meaning of military excellence. Sarah folded her cardigan with deliberate care and placed it on the hood of her car. The three recruits watched her movements with growing confidence, interpreting her methodical approach as nervousness rather than the calculated preparation of someone with extensive combat training. They had no way of knowing that beneath her civilian clothes was a body that had been honed by years of intensive military conditioning and real-world combat experience. Private Jackson was the first to move, stepping forward with the swagger of someone who believed he was about to easily overpower a civilian woman. His high school wrestling experience had made him confident in physical confrontations, and he assumed that his size and strength would quickly end this encounter in his favor. "All right, lady," Jackson said, rolling up his sleeves. "Let's see what you've got. Don't worry, we'll go easy on you." Sarah studied each of the recruits carefully, noting their stances, their body language, and the way they positioned themselves around her. Jackson was clearly the most aggressive of the three, while Chun appeared to be relying on his athletic background for confidence. Rodriguez seemed slightly more cautious, but was still fully committed to the challenge. "Before we begin," Sarah said calmly, "I want to make sure you understand what you're asking for. Are you certain you want to pursue this course of action?" Chun laughed and flexed his muscles dramatically. "Lady, we're trained soldiers. You're just some civilian in a dress. This is going to be over before it starts." Rodriguez nodded in agreement. "We've been through basic training. We know how to handle ourselves in a fight." Sarah almost smiled at their naivety. Basic training was indeed rigorous, but it was designed to prepare soldiers for military life, not to create elite fighters capable of taking on experienced combat veterans. The recruits had learned fundamental skills, but they had no idea of the vast difference between their introductory training and the advanced capabilities they were about to face. "I see," Sarah said quietly. "Well, if you're determined to do this, let's establish some ground rules. This will be a demonstration only. No permanent injuries, no weapons, and we stop when someone yields or is clearly defeated." Jackson scoffed at her conditions. "Rules? This isn't some playground game. This is about proving who belongs on this base and who doesn't." The irony of his statement was profound, given that Sarah had not only belonged on this base but had been instrumental in shaping its current policies and training procedures. Her fingerprints were on everything from recruitment standards to combat readiness protocols. Yet these three recruits were challenging her right to be there. Sarah positioned herself in the center of the small area near the guard station, her stance appearing casual to the untrained eye, but actually representing a perfect combat-ready position. Her weight was evenly distributed, her balance was perfect, and her hands hung loosely at her sides in a way that allowed for instant reaction to any threat. Jackson made the first move, rushing forward with the kind of direct, aggressive approach that might have worked against other recruits, but was exactly what Sarah had expected. His technique was textbook for someone with limited training, telegraphing his intentions clearly and leaving multiple openings for counterattack. Sarah's response was swift and economical. She sidestepped Jackson's charge with minimal movement, using his own momentum against him. Her left hand guided his extended arm, while her right hand applied precise pressure to a nerve point near his shoulder. Jackson found himself spinning past his intended target, completely off balance and vulnerable to whatever came next. Before Jackson could recover, Sarah had stepped behind him and applied a gentle but firm chokehold that cut off his air supply without causing permanent damage. Within seconds, Jackson was tapping frantically against her arm in surrender, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. "That's one," Sarah said quietly, releasing Jackson and allowing him to stumble away, gasping for breath. Chin stared in shock at his fallen comrade before turning his attention back to Sarah. His athletic background had given him confidence in his physical abilities, but what he had just witnessed challenged his assumptions about combat effectiveness. "Lucky move," Chin muttered, though his voice lacked the certainty it had carried moments earlier. "Let's see you do that again." Chin approached more cautiously than Jackson had, using the footwork and stance that had served him well in college sports. However, sports competition and hand-to-hand combat were entirely different disciplines, a fact that Sarah knew well from her years of training soldiers who made the same mistake. When Chin finally committed to his attack, he launched a series of quick punches that would have been effective against another athlete, but were easily anticipated by someone with Sarah's experience. She deflected his strikes with minimal effort, using techniques that redirected his energy rather than meeting force with force. Sarah's counterattack was a masterclass in efficient combat technique. She caught Chin's extended wrist during one of his punches, pivoted smoothly to his side, and applied a joint lock that brought him to his knees instantly. The pain was significant but not damaging, designed to demonstrate control rather than inflict injury. "Yield?" Sarah asked politely, maintaining the lock with just enough pressure to make her point clear. Chin's pride warred with the very real discomfort he was experiencing. "I yield," he gasped through gritted teeth. Sarah released him immediately and stepped back, allowing Chin to cradle his wrist as he moved away from the confrontation area. His face was flushed with embarrassment and the dawning realization that he had seriously underestimated his opponent. Rodriguez was now alone, facing someone who had just effortlessly defeated her two companions without apparent strain or difficulty. The confidence that had driven her to join this challenge was rapidly evaporating, replaced by a growing understanding that she was in a situation far beyond her capabilities. "You don't have to continue," Sarah offered gently. "You've seen what happens, and there's no shame in recognizing when you're outmatched." Rodriguez's pride and family background made backing down difficult. She had grown up in a culture that valued courage and determination, and she felt that yielding without trying would dishonor both her family and her own sense of self-worth. "No," Rodriguez said, though her voice was less certain than it had been. "I started this, and I'll finish it." Sarah nodded respectfully. She understood the cultural pressures that were driving Rodriguez's decision, and she appreciated the young woman's courage even if it was misplaced in this situation. Rodriguez approached the confrontation with more caution than either of her colleagues had shown, having learned from their mistakes. She moved in a circle around Sarah, looking for an opening while trying to avoid the direct approaches that had failed so spectacularly for Jackson and Chin. When Rodriguez finally attacked, she tried to use her speed and smaller size to her advantage, going for Sarah's legs in an attempt to take the fight to the ground where she hoped her training might be more applicable. It was actually a smart tactical decision, demonstrating better combat awareness than her companions had shown. Sarah allowed Rodriguez to make contact, partly out of respect for the young woman's improved approach, and partly to demonstrate another aspect of combat effectiveness. As Rodriguez committed to her takedown attempt, Sarah used her superior balance and core strength to remain upright while controlling Rodriguez's movement. With gentle but firm pressure, Sarah guided Rodriguez into a submission hold that was more educational than painful. She positioned the young recruit in a way that made it clear that resistance was futile while avoiding any risk of injury. "This is what real combat training looks like," Sarah said quietly as she maintained the hold. "What you learned in basic training is just the foundation. There are levels of skill and experience that take years to develop." Rodriguez struggled briefly before accepting the reality of her situation. "I yield," she said, the defeat clear in her voice. Sarah released her immediately and helped the young woman to her feet. Rodriguez looked shaken but not injured, having learned a valuable lesson about the difference between confidence and competence. All three recruits now stood together, nursing their wounded pride and trying to process what had just happened. They had gone from confident challengers to thoroughly defeated opponents in a matter of minutes, facing someone they still believed was a civilian imposter. "Now," Sarah said, straightening her dress and retrieving her cardigan from the car hood, "I think it's time we cleared up the confusion about who I am and whether I belong on this base." Jackson, still rubbing his throat, looked at Sarah with a mixture of fear and bewilderment. "Who are you?" Sarah reached into her purse and pulled out her military identification card, this time removing it from its protective sleeve and holding it where all three recruits could see it clearly. The rank insignia, the official photograph, and the special markings left no doubt about her identity and position. "I am General Sarah Martinez, commanding officer of this installation," Sarah said with quiet authority. "And you three have just made the biggest mistake of your military careers." The color drained from all three faces as the full implications of what had just occurred began to sink in. They had not only challenged a superior officer to a fight, but had specifically targeted the highest-ranking person on the entire base. The potential consequences of their actions were staggering to contemplate. Chen was the first to find his voice. "General, we didn't know your identification." "My identification was perfectly valid," Sarah replied calmly. "You chose not to examine it properly because you made assumptions based on my appearance and civilian clothes. That kind of prejudice and poor judgment has no place in military service." Rodriguez looked like she might be sick. Her dreams of military success and the opportunities she had hoped to create for her family seemed to be crumbling around her. "Ma'am, we're sorry. You thought you could intimidate someone you perceived as weak," Sarah interrupted gently, but firmly. "You thought that your brief training made you superior to someone who didn't fit your narrow definition of what a soldier should look like. These are exactly the kinds of attitudes that this military works to eliminate." The three recruits stood at attention now, their earlier bravado completely replaced by the kind of respectful fear that came from realizing they had made a career-ending mistake. They waited for Sarah to pronounce their fate, expecting immediate disciplinary action that would likely result in their dismissal from military service. Sarah studied their faces carefully, seeing genuine remorse mixed with terror about their futures. These were young people who had made serious errors in judgment, but they were also soldiers who had the potential to learn and grow from this experience if it was handled correctly. "Here's what's going to happen," Sarah said finally. "You're going to return to your posts and complete your duties for today as if nothing happened. Tomorrow morning, you'll report to my office for what will either be a learning experience or the end of your military careers. The choice is yours." The recruits exchanged glances, unable to believe they were being given any kind of second chance after such a monumental breach of military protocol and respect. "Yes, ma'am," they said in unison, their voices barely above a whisper. Sarah nodded and walked back to her vehicle. As she drove through the gate and onto the base, she could see the three recruits in her rearview mirror, standing exactly where she had left them and trying to process everything that had just occurred. The confrontation was over, but the real lessons were just beginning. Sarah had established her authority beyond any possible doubt. But, more importantly, she had created an opportunity for three young soldiers to learn about respect, humility, and the true meaning of military excellence. Whether they would take advantage of that opportunity remained to be seen. The news of what had happened at the main gate spread through Fort Thunder like wildfire. Within hours of Sarah's encounter with the three recruits, every soldier on base had heard some version of the story. The details grew more dramatic with each retelling, but the core facts remained consistent enough to create a buzz of excitement and disbelief throughout the military installation. Sergeant Williams returned to his gate duty to find Jackson, Chun, and Rodriguez standing in stunned silence, still trying to process what had just occurred. Their faces were pale, and their usual confident chatter had been replaced by an uncomfortable quiet that immediately caught his attention. "What happened here?" Williams asked, noting the unusual atmosphere and the recruits' obvious distress. Jackson struggled to find words that would adequately explain their situation without making it sound even worse than it actually was. Sergeant, there was an incident with someone trying to enter the base. What kind of incident? Williams pressed, his experience telling him that something significant had occurred during his brief absence. Chen attempted to provide more detail while downplaying their role in creating the situation. There was a woman in civilian clothes who claimed to be military personnel. We questioned her credentials because she didn't look like she belonged here. Williams raised an eyebrow. And then what happened? Rodriguez took a deep breath before answering. We challenged her to prove she was really military material. It escalated into a physical confrontation. You challenged a civilian to a fight? Williams asked, his voice rising in disbelief. That's just it, Jackson said miserably. She wasn't a civilian. She was General Martinez. The clipboard Williams had been holding dropped from his hands and clattered on the concrete. His face went through several expressions as he processed this information, ranging from shock to horror to a kind of professional sympathy for the 3 recruits who had unknowingly committed career suicide. You challenged the commanding general of this base to a fight, Williams said slowly, as if saying the words might help him understand how such a thing could have happened. We didn't know who she was, Chen said desperately. She was dressed like a civilian, and her ID was hard to read. We thought she was trying to sneak onto the base. Williams shook his head in amazement. Gentlemen, and ma'am, you have just experienced what we might call a career-defining moment. And not in a good way. Within the first hour after the incident, word had reached Major Thompson, who served as Sarah's executive officer and handled much of the day-to-day administration of the base. Thompson had worked with Sarah for 3 years and knew her reputation both as a commander and as someone who had earned her position through exceptional competence rather than political connections. Thompson immediately began making discreet inquiries to understand exactly what had happened and what the potential consequences might be. His first call was to the base's legal officer, Captain Martinez, who happened to share the general's surname, but was no relation. Captain, we may have a situation that requires legal review, Thompson explained. 3 recruits at the main gate apparently challenged General Martinez to a physical confrontation. Captain Martinez paused in his review of the morning's paperwork. I'm sorry, Major, but did you just say that recruits challenged our commanding general to a fight? That's correct. They didn't recognize her in civilian clothes and escalated a routine security check into something much more serious. What was the outcome of this confrontation? Captain Martinez asked, already beginning to consider the various regulations and procedures that might apply to such an unprecedented situation. From what I can gather, the general demonstrated why she earned her combat qualifications. All 3 recruits were quickly and thoroughly defeated without suffering any significant injuries. Captain Martinez whistled softly. That's something you don't see every day. What's the general's position on how to handle this? She's scheduled to meet with them tomorrow morning. I think she's considering this a teaching moment rather than just a disciplinary matter. Meanwhile, in the enlisted quarters, the story was spreading among the junior personnel with the kind of rapid enthusiasm that marked particularly noteworthy events. Corporal Stevens, who had been on duty near the main gate during the incident, had witnessed part of the confrontation from a distance and was now the most sought-after source of first-hand information. I'm telling you, it was like watching a martial arts movie, Stevens told a group of fascinated soldiers in the mess hall. The general took down all 3 of them without even breaking a sweat. Jackson thought he was tough because he wrestled in high school, but she had him tapping out in about 10 seconds. Private First Class Davis shook his head in amazement. I can't believe they didn't recognize her. I mean, her picture is hanging right there in the administration building. Yeah, but she was in civilian clothes, Stevens explained. And these guys are fresh out of basic training. They probably thought they knew everything there was to know about being soldiers. Specialist Rodriguez, who had been listening to the conversation, added her own perspective. You know, I feel kind of bad for them. They're going to be the laughingstock of the entire base. And their military careers are probably over before they really started. The story reached the senior enlisted personnel through Staff Sergeant Mitchell, who had served under Sarah's command at her previous assignment and had tremendous respect for her leadership abilities. Mitchell understood better than most what the 3 recruits had unknowingly stepped into when they challenged her. General Martinez didn't get where she is by accident, Mitchell explained to a group of non-commissioned officers who were discussing the incident. She's earned every rank and every decoration through merit and performance. Those recruits picked a fight with someone who could probably take on half the base and still come out on top. Sergeant First Class Johnson nodded in agreement. I heard she served 3 combat tours before getting promoted to battalion command. The woman has more combat experience than all 3 of those recruits combined will ever have. The real question, added Master Sergeant Williams, is what she's going to do about it. This could be handled as anything from a minor disciplinary matter to a court-martial offense, depending on how seriously she wants to take their challenge to her authority. As the day progressed, the 3 recruits found themselves the subject of curious stares and whispered conversations wherever they went. Their fellow trainees looked at them with a mixture of awe and pity, uncertain whether to be impressed by their audacity or horrified by their poor judgment. During the evening meal, Jackson sat with his food largely untouched, staring at his plate while replaying the day's events in his mind. The memory of being effortlessly defeated by someone he had assumed was just a civilian woman was deeply humbling and more than a little embarrassing. How were we supposed to know? He said to Chun and Rodriguez, who were sitting across from him at the mess hall table. She looked like any other civilian trying to get onto the base. Chun rubbed his wrist, which was still sore from the joint lock Sarah had applied. Maybe that's the point. Maybe we weren't supposed to assume anything based on how someone looks. Rodriguez had been quiet for most of the day, but now she spoke up with the kind of insight that comes from serious reflection. My father always told me that respect is earned, not demanded. Maybe we forgot that respect also has to be given until someone proves they don't deserve it. What do you think she's going to do tomorrow? Jackson asked, voicing the question that had been haunting all 3 of them throughout the day. I don't know, Rodriguez replied honestly. But I think we need to be prepared for the possibility that our military careers are over before they really began. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Drill Sergeant Martinez, who had been looking for the 3 recruits throughout the evening. His expression was serious, but not entirely unsympathetic as he approached their table. You 3 need to come with me, Martinez said. The general wants to see you before tomorrow morning's scheduled meeting. The recruits exchanged worried glances before standing and following Martinez out of the mess hall. Other soldiers watched them go with expressions of curiosity and concern, wondering if they were witnessing the last meal of 3 military careers that had ended before they had really begun. Martinez led them across the base to the administration building, where the lights were still on in several offices despite the late hour. The building felt different at night, more imposing and official than it did during the normal bustle of daytime operations. Wait here, Martinez instructed, indicating chairs in the hallway outside Sarah's office. The general will see you shortly. As the 3 recruits sat in the hallway, they could hear the low murmur of voices from behind Sarah's closed door. It was clear that their case was being discussed by multiple people, which could be either a good sign or a very bad one, depending on the nature of the conversation. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, Sarah's door opened, and Major Thompson emerged, followed by Captain Martinez and several other officers whose presence indicated the seriousness with which their situation was being treated. Send them in, Sarah said from inside her office. The 3 recruits stood and entered the office, where they found Sarah seated behind her desk in full military uniform. The contrast between her current appearance and the woman they had challenged at the gate was striking and served to emphasize just how badly they had misjudged the situation. Please, sit down, Sarah said, indicating chairs that had been arranged in front of her desk. The recruits took their seats and waited for Sarah to begin what they assumed would be the end of their military careers. The office was quiet except for the soft ticking of a clock on the wall, and the tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. I've spent the afternoon reviewing your personnel files and discussing your situation with my staff, Sarah began. What happened today represents a serious breach of military protocol and respect for authority. Jackson, Chun, and Rodriguez braced themselves for the inevitable announcement that they were being discharged from military service. However, Sarah continued, I've also been thinking about what this incident reveals about our training procedures and the assumptions that new recruits bring to their service. The word, however, gave the three young soldiers a glimmer of hope that perhaps their situation was not entirely hopeless. Tomorrow morning, you will begin a special training program designed to address the issues that led to today's incident. This program will last for 1 month and will cover topics including respect for authority, proper security procedures, cultural awareness, and combat readiness. The recruits looked at each other in amazement, hardly daring to believe that they were being given a second chance rather than being drummed out of the military. "This is not a punishment," Sarah clarified. "This is an opportunity for you to learn and grow from a serious mistake. Whether you take advantage of this opportunity will determine the future of your military careers." Relief washed over the three faces, mixed with gratitude and a determination to prove themselves worthy of the chance they were being given. "Thank you, General," Rodriguez said, speaking for all three of them. "We won't let you down." Sarah nodded. "I hope not." Dismissed. As the recruits filed out of her office, Sarah reflected on the day's events and the lessons that could be learned from them. Sometimes the most valuable teaching moments came from the most unexpected situations, and today had certainly provided one of those moments for everyone involved. The morning after their confrontation with General Martinez, Jackson, Chun, and Rodriguez reported to Training Building C at precisely 600 hours. They had barely slept, spending most of the night discussing their incredible fortune at being given a second chance and wondering what the special training program would entail. The building was one of the newer facilities on Fort Thunder, designed specifically for advanced military education and specialized training programs. As they approached the entrance, they were met by Master Sergeant Patricia Williams, a 22-year veteran whose reputation for turning problem soldiers into exemplary military personnel was legendary throughout the base. "Good morning," Williams said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that came from years of dealing with soldiers who needed attitude adjustments. "I am Master Sergeant Williams, and I will be your primary instructor for the next month. You may address me as Master Sergeant or ma'am." The three recruits snapped to attention. "Yes, ma'am," they responded in unison. Williams studied each of them carefully before continuing. "General Martinez has